Miss Adams stares out at the confused looks the high schoolers in her classroom have on their faces. She lets out a sigh of exasperation. "Let me explain one more time," she says, turning to the map on the wall and pointing to Eastern Europe. Ukraine gained independence. Before she can finish her thought, a strange sound fills the classroom. It's the sound of a siren. The shrill noise is dull at first, but as the dust from decades of neglect works its way out of the system, the siren becomes louder. "What is that?" the students say, looking around the room. Miss Adams looks out the window. All is quiet. She walks over to the door and opens it. There's no one in the hallway. Slowly, the other doors start to open, and her colleagues peer their heads out. The teacher in the room next door shrugs. Miss Adams walks back into the classroom and shuts the door behind her. She looks at her class. They shift in their seats. "Is it a fire alarm?" someone asks. "But that doesn't seem right. There are no flashing lights, and a fire drill wasn't in the plan for today." "Everything's fine," she tells the kids. But everything doesn't seem fine. Miss Adams walks over to the window once again. She squints her eyes, and in the distance she can see the skyline of New York City. She turns around and walks toward the phone on the wall to call down to the office. As she walks away from the window, there's a bright flash. Screams erupt from the classroom full of children. They dive under their desks as the room begins to shake. Moments later, the windows explode inward. Shards of glass go flying across the room. Miss Adams falls to the floor. A piece of glass sharp as a knife whizzes over her head and slams into the wall, breaking into hundreds of little pieces. The students are protected from the mayhem as they hunker down under their desks. The siren continues to blare. Miss Adams shakes her head to clear her foggy vision. Her eyes are ringing. She slowly stands up and looks around. The students are scared, but they look to be unharmed. Miss Adams turns toward the window. Her jaw drops. The New York City skyline is gone. She slowly approaches the opening. Warm air blows into the classroom. "Stay under your desks," she says to the students. Miss Adams stares out the window where New York City once stood. A giant mushroom cloud now rises from the earth. The surrounding area is aglow with radioactive fires. A tear falls down her cheek. A nuclear bomb has just hit the east coast of the United States. At the same time Miss Adams' history class was interrupted, an intelligence officer named Corporal Grayson was working out of an Air Force base near Trenton, New Jersey. Grayson had just gotten settled in at his station when he spotted something strange. Satellite feeds indicated there had been a missile launch from the Russian-Ukrainian border. This had become a relatively common occurrence over the last several months. So Grayson chalked it up to the Russians' brutal tactics in their war against Ukraine. However, as Corporal Grayson moved from satellite to try to identify the impact site, he became increasingly worried. The missile had not yet detonated, which meant it was either a misfire or Ukrainian forces weren't the intended target. Grayson zoomed out on his search radius. The missile hadn't exploded anywhere in Europe. "What's going on?" he said out loud. Then he picked something up. It was his worst fears come to life. Grayson pushed his chair away from his workstation and darted for the red phone on the wall. "This is General Rod," the voice said on the other line. "Sir, we have a problem. You need to get to the control room right away," Grayson whispered into the phone. Moments later, an entourage of highly decorated officers barged into the communications room. Grayson was furiously typing on his keyboard. "I think the Russians launched a long-range missile," he yelled over his shoulders. The officers immediately dispersed to the different stations around the room. They looked at the data to determine if the president needed to be informed of the threat right away. Fighter jets were scrambled. They took off toward New York. "I've got it," Grayson yelled. The officers rushed over to his station and looked at the data coming in. A blurry image started to come into focus. "Mother of God," one of the generals said. "Is that the Russian hypersonic missile we were briefed on a while back?" "Yes, sir," Grayson confirmed. "And it's headed straight toward New York City." The day the nuke detonated over the east coast of the United States was the day World War III started. The blast was immense, as the bomb had a 1 megaton payload. Times Square and most of Manhattan were vaporized in the initial blast. In an instant, over 1 million people died. As the shockwave and radiation spread outward, millions more would perish. The explosion heated up the surrounding area to thousands of degrees, incinerating buildings, cars, and roads. The superheating of the air also caused a massive change in pressure, which resulted in a shockwave with winds blowing hundreds of miles per hour, strong enough to blow people off their feet and cause trees to topple. This shockwave extended for 3 miles in all directions, but it was the radiation from the explosion that would end up killing the most people. As the mushroom cloud rose into the air, it carried radioactive particles with it. The wind pushed these particles northeast. The fallout covered parts of Brooklyn and Queens, but the Bronx was the borough that received the largest dose of radiation. The fallout continued to travel with the wind, which carried it up the east coast of the United States, reaching as far north as New Hampshire. Hours after the blast, Corporal Grayson has a moment to breathe. He's been relieved by another officer so he can contact his wife, who's a school teacher in New Jersey. She teaches history, and he knows that she has an excellent view of the New York City skyline from her classroom, or at least she did, until it was wiped off the face of the earth. Grayson dials his cell phone. The phone rings and rings and rings. "Come on, pick up, please pick up," he prays. There's a pause in the ringing, then a familiar voice answers. "Thank God you're okay," Grayson says in the receiver. Miss Adams is still in the school. It's become a shelter for families needing food and water. Many in the community commuted to the city for work, and even though the town was spared from the blast and the initial fallout, at least half of its residents were lost in the attack. Corporal Grayson explains what's happening to his wife. A nuke was fired using a long-range hypersonic missile. The United States believed Russia was still decades away from making the weapon operational, but as Putin became more and more frustrated with his shortcomings in the war with Ukraine, he took drastic measures. It was more luck than anything else that the hypersonic missile actually worked. But now the east coast of the United States is consumed in flames and radiation. Putin couldn't be happier. After the bomb detonated, the United States immediately went into lockdown. All flights were grounded, the borders were closed up, no one was allowed in or out. The armed forces were instantly mobilized, and since it was clear where the nuke came from, soldiers were ordered to report to their bases for immediate deployment. New York City is in ruins, and much of the northeast coast will be covered in fallout. The military sends doctors and medics to the surrounding areas to help the hospitals deal with millions of people with burns, radiation sickness, and wounds caused by blunt force trauma. The death toll will continue to rise, and over the next several years, anyone who received even a small dose of the initial radiation will need to be examined for cancer. The nuke will have long-lasting effects on the east coast of the United States, but none of that might matter, as NATO is about to go to war with Russia. After the nuke struck Manhattan, the US immediately reached out to its allies and informed them of what was going on. They needed to take care of things at home, but Russia had declared war on the free world, and now the nations of NATO needed to make them pay. The UK and France armed their own nukes and await the orders from high command. Even though the United States had been attacked, military leaders know the consequences of retaliating with nukes. If World War III becomes a nuclear war, the entire planet will be at risk. There is no winners in a war where NATO and Russia continuously fire nukes at one another. However, this does not mean they will not be going to war. After the nuke hit the East Coast, all negotiations were off the table. The US will be invading Russia, and Vladimir Putin will pay. A nuke hitting New York City is a worst-case scenario, and the enemy knew this. There's no doubt that wherever a nuclear bomb detonates, there will be mass destruction and countless lives lost. However, New York City is the most densely populated urban center in the US. By firing a nuke here, it ensures it'll cause the most amount of casualties. Another side effect of nuking New York City is much more widespread. If a nuke hits the east coast of the United States, economies all around the world will crash. This may not be the most immediate concern, but if New York City is wiped off the face of the planet, the world economy could collapse. All-out war will likely occur, so nations around the world will start gearing up. The private sector will pool its resources and start building more weapons and machinery to help in the war effort. The US dollar and economy will probably tank as investors pull their money from the stock market. But what if another nuke detonated somewhere else on the east coast of the United States? Regardless of the exact target, the results would likely be the same. The US military would mobilize and immediately strike whoever was responsible for the atrocious act. All NATO countries would send aid to the United States and help in any way they could. The nuclear arsenals of NATO would be put on high alert, and at any given moment the world could be plunged into nuclear war. A nuke going off in New York City would most definitely cause the most casualties as far as targets on the east coast of the United States would go, but there's another key location that an enemy could strike. If someone wanted to hit the heart of America, they would detonate a nuke in Washington, D.C. Moments before the nuke strikes New York City, the President of the United States sits in the Oval Office sipping coffee. It's been a long night. Decisions needed to be made about further sanctions being placed on the countries aiding Russia in the war against Ukraine. Suddenly, a squad of Secret Service agents burst through the door. The President startles, spilling his coffee across the desk. "Sir, we need to get you out of here," the lead agent yells. The President grabs his jacket from the back of his chair and is escorted out of the room. "What's going on?" he asks. There's no time to talk. Agents rush him toward Marine One. The helicopter's propellers are already spinning. The agents desperately try to get the President on board. "Where's my family?" he asks. "They'll be right behind you, sir." The agent yells over the chopper's blades, cutting through the air. The President stops dead in his tracks. "I'm not leaving without them," he says, but it doesn't matter. Before anyone can protest, there's a bright flash. A nuke explodes in downtown D.C. The dome of the Capitol building instantly melts. Washington Monument goes up in flames like a torch. The White House is obliterated. In a millisecond, the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of the U.S. government are all wiped out. Luckily, the vice president was visiting family on the other side of the country. She's immediately informed of the incident at the Capitol and is rushed to a secure location where she starts making decisions about rescue efforts in DC and New York City and how to best help the people in those areas that need medical attention. She contacts one of her closest advisors, a general working out of an airbase in New Jersey, to become her new Secretary of Defense. The National Guard is deployed to the surrounding regions. These soldiers are provided with radiation suits and iodine tablets to give them an extra layer of protection. They have to wait several days for the fires to die out before they can search for survivors in downtown DC. During this time, anyone who is exposed to the fallout is brought to the closest hospital where they're treated for burns and radiation sickness. The initial blast killed 500,000 people in DC and wiped out most members of the U.S. government. As the wind swept through the Capitol, it carried radioactive particles north, covering Maryland, Philadelphia, and parts of New Jersey. The fallout reaches as far as Connecticut, where it isn't as deadly but can still cause complications, especially for anyone who ingests contaminated food or water. If Washington, D.C. was destroyed, there could be a slight delay in action as a new chain of command would need to be put in place. But as soon as the vice president or whoever was next in line to become president was sworn in, the full might of the U.S. military would be unleashed on whoever committed the atrocity. B-2 bombers carrying massive payloads or their own nuclear bombs would take off and unleash a firestorm upon enemy military bases and at key strategic locations. Nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers would be repositioned to areas where they could launch counteroffensives and fire high-powered conventional missiles at the enemy. Next, there would be boots on the ground and tanks rolling toward the enemy capital to remove the current regime from power. NATO would mobilize to aid in the war effort, but one thing is absolutely sure to happen. If the east coast of the US was attacked by nuclear weapons, there would be retaliation on a scale that the world has never seen before. Time would be of the essence, as the longer the enemy remained in control and had access to their weapons arsenal, the more likely it would be that another nuke would hit the US. Perhaps the next nuke would be fired at the southeastern coast of the US. Marcus sits on his fishing boat with the line in the water. He hasn't caught much today and decides maybe it's time to head in and cut his losses. He begins reeling in the line when suddenly it gets stuck. Marcus pulls and pulls, but whatever's on the hook is gigantic. He smiles. Perhaps this will make up for not catching anything else that day. He hopes it's a tuna or a swordfish. At this point, he thinks it could be a tiger shark, as whatever he's caught won't let him reel it in. Suddenly, the water all around him starts to bubble. The boat whips back and forth. Marcus lets go of the rod and grabs onto the side of the boat for dear life. Out of the depths of the ocean, a metal hull appears. On the side is a 5-pointed red star. It's a Russian submarine rising to the surface. Marcus shouts in terror as his boat capsizes and he's thrown into the water. A few moments later, Marcus surfaces. The Russian sub sits on the water like a giant metal whale coming up for air. He watches in horror as a hatch opens up on the top of the sub. There's a rumbling sound and a missile launches from its tube. It rises up into the air, arcing toward downtown Miami. For a moment, Marcus can't breathe. He watches as the nuclear warhead falls from the sky. It disappears for a second before a bright flash of light fills the sky. Marcus goes blind for a moment. He thrashes in the water trying to catch his breath and reorient himself. He blinks hard just in time to see the Russian sub sink back down below the water and disappear. He looks around for his boat, hoping he can climb onto it and wait to be rescued. Surely, the Coast Guard will come to the aid of the people of Miami. Marcus spots his capsized boat and starts swimming to it. Before he can reach the side, he feels a wind against the back of his head. Marcus slowly turns around and treads water. He closes his eyes and shakes his head. A tidal wave created by the nuclear blast is rushing toward him at hundreds of miles per hour. In that moment, he thinks about his family. He wonders if there's any way his wife, who works in the local fish shop, could have survived the blast. He then thinks of his twin brother, who is the president's detail in the Secret Service. He hopes he's okay, even though deep down he knows no one is safe. Marcus grabs onto the side of his boat and grips it tightly. The sea was his entire life, and now it will claim it. Approximately 200,000 people die instantly in Miami as the result of the nuclear blast. The fallout would likely drift out into the Atlantic, with some radiation reaching the Bahamas. It is the thought of this horrifying scenario that would lead the United States and NATO to take immediate action and destroy any enemy nuclear launch site or housing facilities as quickly as possible. That being said, if US and NATO forces invaded a country with nuclear capabilities like Russia, there's a good chance they would deploy everything they had in their arsenals. Cities across the world would be targeted by nuclear weapons, and millions of people would be vaporized or succumb to the horrors of radiation poisoning. Regardless of who fired the nuke or why, there's a very real possibility that if the east coast of the United States was bombed, the world would come to a terrible end. The last thing the United States or most countries want is nuclear war. However, if a nation like Russia was the one who detonated the nuke and the US tried to fight back, Russia would likely unleash their entire arsenal, which contains enough nukes to cover most of the European and North American continents in radioactive fallout. There are several cities that are likely to be major targets on the East Coast if a nuke was ever launched at the US. New York City and Washington, D.C. are definitely the two most likely areas to get hit for reasons mentioned earlier. However, cities like Boston, Atlanta, Annapolis also could be targets. The problem with being on either coast when it comes to war is that submarines equipped with nuclear warheads could theoretically find their way to an area where they could hit several key targets. Take DC, for instance. If an enemy sub loaded with several nukes found itself off the coast of Delaware and Maryland, or even worse, in the Chesapeake Bay, it could hit several major East Coast cities all at once. Baltimore, Richmond, Philadelphia, Annapolis, and DC would be within firing range. The terrifying part is that once the nukes were deployed, it would be impossible to stop them before they reached their targets. This would give residents in these cities little time to seek shelter and hide from the oncoming apocalypse. That is, if they received any warning at all. The last time serious nuclear drills were carried out in the United States was during the Cold War. The sirens and fallout shelters of that era have fallen into disuse, and it's highly unlikely the average US citizen knows where the closest fallout shelter is. Even if there was time to warn a population of an incoming nuclear strike, it's doubtful people would know what to do. There would be mass hysteria up until the nuke reached its target and detonated. Make no mistake, if a nuke hit the east coast of the US, it would almost certainly be the end of the world. The only way that World War III wouldn't start would be if whoever detonated the device had no political ties or worked for a terrorist group. In these circumstances, the world might rally around the attack and decide that nukes are much too dangerous to be used in conventional warfare. Perhaps if this happened, all countries that possess these doomsday devices would decommission them and lock them away, so they could never be used again. This is wishful thinking, however. It's much more likely that if nukes ever did go off on the east coast of the US, the world would be put on a path to nuclear war, and missiles would start flying across the planet in a desperate attempt to wipe out the enemy before they themselves are wiped out. In this scenario, Miss Adams, Corporal Grayson, the Vice President, Marcus, and every other human on the planet, including you, likely wouldn't survive. Now watch What If Russia Launched a Nuclear Bomb Minute by Minute? Or check out This Is How You Actually Survive a Nuclear Attack.